Hello, everybody. This is Johnny White coming at you from my dining room. And sorry this video is a little late. I've been having Wi-Fi issues at home, but that's a whole nother story. So, this week's we're looking at the Cold War and how it affected life here in the United States. Now, remember, the Cold War starts right after the end of World War II, and essentially it is the United States and our allies and the Soviet Union and their allies, and the two sides are kind of stirring at each other for several decades, for about 50 years. And we're always on the brink of war. We're ready to fight at any time. And we're both trying to gobble up as many countries as we can. We've talked about those reasons, and there were philosophical or ideological reasons. You know, communist governments don't practice freedom of speech. They don't have freedom of the press, freedom of religion, all the freedoms that we enjoy here at home. And another big reason we didn't like them was because they closed their borders to us. And a big part of our foreign policy is honestly making money. And we like to sell our products everywhere. We've talked about it before, you can get a Coca-Cola or a Big Mac almost anywhere in the world. You can buy Nikes, and you can buy Levi's, and you can buy Fords, and all over the world. And so a lot of what we do is to protect those what are called markets, okay? And every country that falls to a communist government closes their markets to us, usually. China has opened up over the years, so we tolerate China quite a bit because they are the biggest population in the world, and they've got, I don't know how many billion people now, 2 billion, 3 billion people, and so that's a lot of people. That's a lot of Nikes. It's a lot of Coca-Colas, so we make a lot of money. So there are those two kind of aspects to it. But so the Cold War was us trying to contain the Soviet Union, and they were trying to spread communism around the world. And in 1949, the Soviet Union is going to drop their first or test their first atom bomb. So now both the United States and the Soviet Union have atom bombs. So things get really scary from there on out. Because the threat of atomic or nuclear war is always there. And it wasn't long before both countries had more than enough weapons to completely destroy each other, and probably the whole world. And so that was kind of a terrifying thing. And our rivalry with the Soviet Union is going to get us into a hot war, actual combat in Korea and Vietnam. And we'll have advisors and things in Central America in the 80s and all over the place. So it was a big deal. And so that's all kind of away overseas, but things were changing a lot here at home too. So let's look at that. And generally, this is regarded with the late 40s and 1950s, the end of World War II. Harry Truman's the president from the great state of Missouri. And he takes over for FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, in early 1945. So he sees gets us through the end of World War II and ushers in the new era. And at the end of World War II, the U.S. and the Soviet Union are definitely the two biggest, toughest kids in the world. And the United States begins to grow economically a lot. Factories and industry was booming. So life, in a lot of ways, in the U.S. after World War II was real good. You had all the returning soldiers, and they had money in their pocket because they got paid and really didn't spend much money normally. During World War II, there was also what's called the GI Bill, which paid for soldiers to go to college. So you've got soldiers coming home, either getting jobs or going to school, and graduating and getting jobs. And we were making a lot of money. And factories were turning out lots of different things. And we've talked about it before. You know, if you got a job at a car factory, at a car plant with United Auto Workers, you were in good shape. And it didn't take a college degree to get one of those jobs, and You wouldn't get rich, but you would be firmly in the middle class, and you could afford a nice middle class house, and you would have a nice pension for when you retire, and you would have health benefits for you and your family, and it was a good way to make a living. And there were a lot of those jobs around, and things were good. In about 1950-51, there communism spreading through Korea, and Harry Truman's going to send troops there to fight. They were typically called the North Koreans, and which borders China and is still obviously North Korea today. And we go in and we fight. And at one point, we're very, very close to pushing all the communists back across the border into China, and then China invades. So for a little while there, we are actually fighting the Chinese in Korea. And they push us all the way back south in the peninsula. And eventually we get to kind of a stalemate right in the middle of the peninsula. And we call a truce with the Chinese, and we split Korea into two. North Korea became communist, and South Korea became free, and those countries are still there today, and you still hear a lot about them. So that was a product of the post-World War II Cold War era. And again, that thing's going to play out in Vietnam, much the same way. The war was what's much different, and eventually we do just retreat and pull out of Vietnam, and the whole thing becomes communist. Today, Vietnam is a good trading partner of ours because they have opened up some of their markets, and they allow us to put factories there. And we've talked about this before too. Lots and lots of shoes, Nikes, are made in Vietnam, which is a whole nother discussion. But so they are communists, but friends with us. They're on our good side because they allow us to make money through them. We're getting back to the money and how it dictates foreign policy. But so again, things here at home. Harry Truman's president in 1945. He wins presidency again in 1948. And in those days, newspapers were the big form of news. And there were morning newspapers and evening newspapers. And I don't remember what the newspaper was. It was a morning newspaper, and the night of the election, presidential election, November 1948, as the polls were coming back, Truman was losing to a guy named Thomas Dewey, who I believe was from Cleveland. And as you know, a lot of times these morning papers, they had to be finished by about 6 in the morning so they could start getting delivered, and you'd have a paper at your front porch at 7 in the morning. Well, that means those papers had to go to print, as they would call it, about midnight. And at midnight, wherever city this paper was from, Truman was losing. And so they printed on the headline, big letters, Dewey defeats Truman. And there's a classic picture of Harry Truman. In the next morning, when all the polls came in finally, Truman came back and won. So that newspaper was wrong. And it's a classic American picture of him holding a newspaper that says Dewey defeats Truman when actually he'd won. And that took place, that famous picture was taken in Union Station, downtown St. Louis. So he wins in 1948. The next presidential election is 1952. And a guy named Dwight D. Eisenhower wins. We know that name because he was the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe during World War II. And he comes home from the war and he retires from the military and he runs for president. And he wins in 1952 and he wins again in 1956. And he was a Republican, so let's see, FDR had been a Democrat, and he was elected, and Harry Truman was a Democrat. FDR was elected in 32, and so for 20 years, from 32 all the way to 52, the Democrats ran the White House. The Republicans are going to control it for the next 8 under Dwight D. Eisenhower. And those Eisenhower years are generally thought of as very prosperous. Like I said, a lot of factories humming along, paying good wages to working class America. We were doing pretty well. And we'll get into this more next week or the week after that, but it is also still extremely segregated in the United States. Life for African Americans was not good. And the 50s will see the birth of what we know as the civil rights movement. We're going to get to know Martin Luther King Jr. That's when he gets to be famous. And the civil rights and Rosa Parks and all that really starts ramping up during the 50s because life was not good. And we always say this in class, we associate segregation and Jim Crow laws with the South, where it was very open. The signs, coloreds only and whites only and all that stuff is in the South, but the entire country was segregated. Everybody associates it with the South because it was more overt, but every place was segregated. If you were an African American successful businessman in St. Louis in the 1950s and trying to buy a house in Creve Coeur, it wasn't going to happen. They weren't going to sell you one. You couldn't do it. So we'll talk about more about that later. But so 48, 52, 56. Harry Truman wins in 48, Eisenhower in 52 and 56. Things are pretty good economically here at home. One of the things, and that was one of your summaries, another thing you were asked to identify was the Eisenhower interstate system. And let's talk about that for a minute. Many of you use the Eisenhower interstate system to get to school every day. And interstates are the big, very fast highways that we all know about. Right? And they're called limited access because you have to get on, merge through ramps. You can't there are no cross streets, right? There are no stoplights. There's nobody's driveway leading up to the or alley leading to the street. So it's limited access. And that's when you get to speed limits of 55 and 60 in cities, and then out in rural areas it can be 70, 75. They didn't have those before the 1950s. So highways before the 1950s just consisted of, they were called highways, but it would be one lane in each direction, and they're not divided. It's the same road. The most famous of this was Route 66, which went from Chicago to Los Angeles through St. Louis. And it was slow going on those things because when he went through towns, the speed limit came down to 35 miles an hour, and there'd be stoplights and stop signs, and you had driveways and parking lots and shops and everything on either side. So you had to watch out for a lot of things. So it would take you a long time to get somewhere. President Eisenhower was part of a group after World War I that got on an Army convoy in, I believe, South Carolina and drove to California just to see how long it would take. And I think it took them about a month. Today, with the interstates, if you wanted to drive from South Carolina to California, it would take you, if you were stopping at nighttime, maybe 4 days, maybe 5. If you had somebody so that you could take turns driving, you'd be there in 2 days, maybe 2.5, something like that. So much, much quicker. And so one thing that Eisenhower had noticed during World War II in Germany was that Hitler had built an extensive highway system in Germany. And Eisenhower wanted to replicate that here in the United States. And sometimes along interstates, you'll see signs that say Dwight Eisenhower Interstate System. And it was good because for 2 reasons. Number one, we could get our troops all over the country a lot quicker with an interstate system than riding down Route 66. Number one. Number two, commercially it was really good. It was real good for sales. If I own a shoe factory in Poughkeepsie and I need to get an order of shoes to Chicago, with the old highway system, that would take me at least 2 or 3 days. With an interstates, that'll take me 24 hours, something like that. So a lot more money being made. We're back to money dictating things. And so that was the Eisenhower interstate system. McCarthyism was another big one. That's your next subject. And that was going on here at home. And it's weird to talk about this on video, but I'll try to describe it. Senator Joseph McCarthy was I believe, a Republican senator out of Minnesota. And his thing became sniffing out communism in the United States. And that became a very scary thing. There were some people that were busted as communist spies. Famously, there was a couple in New York City that were passing secrets to the Soviets, and they were executed. So he starts trying to sniff out perceived communists in the United States, which is an interesting thing, because all it took was somebody to accuse you of being communist, and you were in trouble. And you might get dragged before the Senate in the worst case scenario. You might get dragged before city leaders or state leaders. Now remember, we have freedom of speech. We have freedom of thought. There is a legal communist party in the United States. It's not illegal to be a communist in the United States, but it was very much frowned upon. And if you got accused of being a communist, you'd have a hard time getting a bank loan, or you'd have a hard time buying a house. You'd have a hard time getting a new job. People didn't want to associate with you, that kind of thing. And it became very, very prevalent. People would point their fingers at other leaders and call them communists. And it became a thing where if you had a rival business leader, you could call him a communist, and maybe business would go your way. Because let's face it, how do you deny being a communist? How do you declare your love for the United States? You can say, hey, I say Pledge of Allegiance every morning, and I love this country dearly. I take my hat off and stand up at the baseball game when the national anthem plays. And your opponent would say, and that's exactly what a communist would do. That's exactly how a communist would hide. That's exactly how a communist would try to make people believe that he's not a communist. So it was a very, very almost nonsensical approach to everything, because defending yourself was almost futile. It just came down to whether or not people believed you, because there was no absolute definite proof one way or another. A famous book was written by a famous playwright named Arthur Miller, and it was called The Crucible. And it was set in Salem in the 1600s during the Salem witch trials. And obviously they were accusing young women of being witches, and how we all know you can't be a witch. They don't exist, right? But how do you defend yourself against that? You'd say, the young women would say, I'm not a witch. I love my country, and I love God, and I love my family. And the townspeople would say, and that's exactly what a witch would say. And they ended up killing them. And so this was written as a mirror to the things that were going on in the United States in the 1950s under the McCarthy era and McCarthyism. And for long decades and decades to come, if you were accused of being a communist, that was a bad thing. And today you hear the word socialist. You don't hear communism. But communism is a brand of socialism, and people will talk about socializing medicine or socializing healthcare, socializing education. And to some people, that's an okay thing. You're making the playing field level for everybody in these industries. Other people still, socialism is a bad word. Oh no, you're a step away from a communist. You can't be that here in the United States. So that was McCarthyism. The last thing you were asked to describe was duck and cover. And we talked about the proliferation of atomic and nuclear warheads and bombs during the 50s and 60s. Duck and cover is even older than me, and it was a strategy that was taught in schools and on, they had little duck and cover jingles on TV, and they told you if there was, there were nuclear sirens, bomb raid sirens. We still have them. We don't test them. They are the ones that go off first Monday of the month. For now, we associate them with tornadoes and things, tornado sirens, but they would also be used as a bombing or an invasion siren. So the thought was always, if you heard the bomb warning, duck and cover, and it was everything from duck underneath your desk at school, or your table in a restaurant, or underneath your front porch, and cover your head. Get down and cover up. And this was supposed to save you from an atomic or nuclear warhead or bomb. It's not going to do that. If you are that close and you somehow manage to survive, you are probably going to die from radiation poisoning. So duck and cover was not a practical thing, but it was a way that the government was trying to pacify the people, make everything okay with the people. This arms race was okay. Hey, if we get bombed, just duck and cover, we'll be okay. But it really wasn't. So those quickly are your words and definitions. So write summaries of those and get them in to me. And I thank you all very much. I hope to see you very soon. Please stay safe, and we will chat again next week. Adios.